Well, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. America's best days are yet to come.
This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Dr. Daron Shaw. Dr. Shaw is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, the co-director of the Fox News poll, and one of the pair of pollsters who conducts our annual Reagan National Defense Survey. Roger and Daron discuss the latest defense survey results, as well as his recent article in National Affairs and the effect of high voter turnout on a political party.
Daron Shaw, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Well, you are a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. For those watching, that explains the picture behind Daron right now. And you're also the co-director of the Fox News poll. Tell us how you got into polling and why. It's something that a lot of people have strong feelings about, but they often don't really like what they see.
Well, I went to UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, as an undergraduate. I was interested in politics. And like a lot of us are interested in politics, I was as or more interested in process as I was in public policy, which I guess makes me shallow and light in some ways. So I'll dress it up by saying I was interested in democratic processes.
There we go.
Campaigns. And I took a wonderful class there from my guy who turned out to be my mentor, John Petrosic, who was a specialist in campaigns and voting. And there was a dedicated section in this public opinion and voting class, an honors section, where he actually, gave us a data set, a polling data set, taught us how to use a statistical package, and gave us kind of a, in addition to the regular course, had this sort of crash course in real statistical analysis of data. And I guess, Roger, the easiest way to sort of put it is I was and remain fascinated by the right brain and left brain elements of public opinion research. There is an art to it, and there is a science to it, and that fascinated me. Right? How do you craft a question? How do you put it in a way that real people can understand and is going to elicit correct or thoughtful opinions? And then on the other side, how do you do the probability part of it correctly? How do you make sure it's representative? All those things together really intrigued me. As someone who likes both art and science, it was kind of a nice place to be.
Interesting. So the art and the science, the right side, left side of the brain. Do this for our listeners and watchers. Polling is not something that, at least my sense in anecdotally, people really trust or feel confident about and are somewhat skeptical. I'm sure you hear that all the time when your students and peers and just a popular treatment. Tell us why polling should be trusted and should be used and is still a useful and important tool.
Sure. I think that maybe the number one question I get both in class with my undergraduates here at University of Texas, and then when I speak to larger audiences is, how can you possibly represent the opinions of all Americans based on 800 interviews? Or a flip side is people say, look, I've never been polled. So how can you claim to represent people like me? And the simplest way I could put it is, what we're trying to do is uncover some, in some ways, unknowable truth. That is to say, there's a population, whether it's America or Texas or California or wherever, there is a true distribution of opinion towards President Biden, President Trump, President Reagan, whoever we're talking about. People have attitudes about that person, and what polling attempts to do is to discover those attitudes. And we've known since the early part of the last century that there is a statistical way to do that. And it's associated with some things that are way too kind of in the weeds for people to care much about, the law of large numbers, and
right.
But the easiest version of it is, if you want to discover, let's take a coin flip as an example. There is a true probability with respect to flipping a coin: 50% heads, 50% tails. If you flip a coin 3 times, you might get 3 straight heads, right? But the more you flip the coin, the more likely you are. In other words, if you think of each flip as a case,
right,
the more likely you are to uncover the true distribution of heads versus tails. So as you get to 10 flips, 20 flips, 100 flips, you're going to get roughly 50% heads and 50% tails, right? And that's what we do in polling. if you randomly sample enough people, you're going to, construct an estimate of the true
You're going to get closer
distribution
to
of
the
opinion.
truth.
Exactly. And so my friend at Fox News, Dana Blanton, who's the research director there, she uses, the soup analogy, right? Which is, there's a pot of soup is like all of the opinions out there. And what you're doing with the poll is you're going and you're taking a spoonful and you're tasting it. And from that taste, you understand if there's too much salt, too much sugar, you get a real sense of the flavor of the soup. You don't need to drink the entire vat. I guess this is the easy way to put it.
Even though one individual feels that their particular flavor or spice may not be captured there specifically,
right.
somehow it's going to be incorporated, playing with your analogy here.
Right. She prefers the soup analogy. I use the blood analogy, which is when a doctor is diagnosing you, they don't need to drain your body of blood to get a sense of what, whether there's disease present, whether you're healthy. They simply
You just
take
went
a small
Texas
sample.
on us. You went from soup to blood. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is where we have these conflicts. Dana's opinion is, why do you use the blood analogy all the time?
That's right. Well, another way I think about polling is there's a predictive element, which is generally what irks people. The polls are saying this person will win or lose, and then the reality may be somewhat different. It takes people like you to explain, well, perhaps you weren't interpreting the poll correctly, or this wasn't a comprehensive poll. And then there's kind of polling to explain what happened as well.
Yeah.
Both I know you're involved in. We, of course, in the greater D.C. area had the Virginia gubernatorial election that got national attention with the election of Glenn Youngkin. Based on the polling you've seen, what do you think drove those numbers there? What was the story? What are the takeaways from your analysis of the polling in terms of explaining what happened?
Yeah, well, we meaning Fox News, had a poll. We did 3 Virginia polls over the course of the campaign, 1 in September, 2 in October. The last poll we did was came out of the field about 9 days, 10 days before the election. And our poll had, amongst all registered voters in Virginia, I think we had 1,100, 1,200 cases. We had Youngkin +1. But at that point, late in the campaign, we, like most pollsters, switched to a likely voter screen. And in the case of Fox News, we ask a couple of attitudinal questions, most of which deal with voting. How likely are you to vote? How interested are you in the election? How engaged are you, et cetera? And they're a light touch. In other words, if people tell us they're interested and they're going to vote, they're a likely voter. We're not, doing background checks on them or something, for goodness sakes. But and what we found in the Virginia race was that, remember that +1 Youngkin lead amongst registered voters. Well, that went to +8 with our likely voter screen. And, we had long conversations about, is our screen is it too demanding?
That was a little surprising. I mean, just looking at your body language there, right? And that's a big jump.
Exactly. And, we, like a lot of the media polls, but we take pride on this. We're very transparent. So we put both numbers out there. And then in the, in our write-up of the poll, we basically said, look, this election really seems to be about Republican engagement and enthusiasm compared to Democratic. Complacency is kind of a strong word, but there just wasn't the same kind of intensity the Democrats had displayed in 2018, 2020, when, they would have walking across broken glass to get out and vote against Donald Trump. Well, that wasn't there this time. And, so the interesting thing was we thought we'd captured the story of the election, right? Was that Republican enthusiasm and interest in the election was significantly higher than the Democrats. But we also said, look, this poll, to your point, Roger, is a snapshot in time. This is 9 to 10 days out.
Right.
And we know that the Democratic campaigns, McAuliffe has really shown this in his past campaigns, they know how to mobilize voters. So, I think my colleague Chris Anderson's quote was, look, there's time for McAuliffe to really get back into this. But
the world can change in 8 days, and all of a sudden people are motivated to get out there.
Yeah. So the essence of your question, though, is a really good one, which is, as pollsters, we know the predictive element of what we're doing is why people are interested. If our polls aren't predictive, then nobody really cares. But we also, so we want to take advantage of that, and we love the fact that that's what causes people to read these polls. But on the other hand, we're constantly almost arguing against ourselves, saying, I know this is why you're looking at this poll, but things can change. And I guess it can seem a little duplicitous from the public, but we're really serious about it, right? Which is, we all think politics matter. Politics is fluid. It's not static. And so, the kind of weasel language that you hear associated with polls a lot of times is important. It's important to remind people that, hey, this is where we are right now. And in our case, we actually thought there's reason to believe the race will tighten, that Democrats will get engaged late. But we were kind of happy we came out directionally on the right side of that of that election outcome, I have to say.
And then indeed it played out. So that likely voter poll that you're referencing 8 days before the election seemed to hold.
Yeah, and I think, again, it told the story of the election. That was an election in which the constellation of issues that motivated people was highly favorable to the Republicans. I mean, if you sort of take public education issues, especially kind of curriculum arguments and COVID mandates as being the top issue, COVID was still there more generally as an issue, and that favored the Democrats. But the issues involving education, immigration, believe it or not, was on the radar screen in Virginia, and the economy were all favorable to Youngkin. McAuliffe was, even though he wasn't running for re-election, he was kind of seen as the incumbent. And what we saw in our polling,
been there before,
yeah, and he never got really much. He got to 50%, I think, or 51% in one of the three polls that we did, and it's a conventional wisdom, but it's a reasonable one. If the incumbent or person defending the seat for the incumbent party can't break 50%, typically that person's got some problems.
Two quick follow-ups. One, the education issue. I mean, the DMV was littered with the commercial of McAuliffe during the debate saying something to the effect of, parents shouldn't have a choice in what their children are taught in schools. Did you see that issue? Did that matter to the I mean, I'm assuming they were throwing all this money in commercials because it really was firing up voters. And then related, second, when you're talking about what happened, it seemed like there was motivation on the Republican voters, and Democratic voters weren't going to turn out. They were not, the voters you were talking to, there weren't as many kind of going into that likely voter category. So, one, talk about the education piece, and was that a good investment by the campaign that really trying to drive more people into that voter column? And two, was it a Democrats sitting on the sidelines, or the numbers were more just Republicans really came out for Youngkin?
Yeah, I'll take the second question first. Extraordinarily high turnout election for an off year, statewide election.
Right, because this is not a midterm, this is not a presidential
right.
election. Virginia's weird. This is like just a year after Biden, presidential election. That's the off year.
Yeah, it's political junkies love Virginia and New Jersey in these off year elections because they give us something to do in between these sort of big contests. And people read too much into them sometimes because again, we're a year out from the midterm elections and a lot can change. But the education issue was fascinating to watch. I tend to think, so first of all, was the investment, I'll sort of hopscotch back and forth between the two questions. I'll turn to Virginia real quickly with education. Was the investment good? Well, first, it's interesting, as a pollster, we came in and confirmed something that the Youngkin and everybody with a political brain understood immediately when McAuliffe made that statement in the debate about, well, I don't think parents should be telling the school boards what to teach kids. That just sounds so bad to the ear. I mean, you don't have to have a advanced degree in political science to know that's not a great statement. And they immediately turned out and ran commercials. We included in, I think, our second survey, we asked a question specifically about whether you agree with that statement. And it was close to 3/4, I think about 75% of Virginians said they disagreed with that. And a large chunk of them said strongly disagreed. And then in both that poll and then in the last survey that we did, the late one in Virginia, we asked a question, which candidate do you think would better handle? And we listed a series of issues, from the economy to COVID to public education. And now this is an issue, education typically is an issue that Democrats dominate. There are very few Republicans who beat Democratic candidates on the issue of education. And Youngkin was ahead of McAuliffe on the issue. And, you understand the Democratic advantage traditionally because education tends to be dominated by which party is going to spend more on education. Democrats tend to win these spending fights. But clearly the criteria people were using when they came to evaluate public education was different in Virginia.
It's about content and choice.
content choice, curricular control. I
Yep.
think a backlash against, in particular, I distinguish between school boards and school administrators. I mean, we have these issues in Texas right now, and I've been kind of championing this when we do these polls. I don't think it's right to ask about school boards. School boards don't typically have a lot of control over curricula. They make broad decisions, but they're usually reviews of curricular development.
Okay.
Curriculum set by school administrators, and I think that's the focal point of the ire of parents in Virginia, and here in Austin in the Eaton School District and the Austin AISD District. It's the administrators who are perceived to have a political agenda, more so than the school boards are elected, administrators are not, and that's kind of an important distinction here. So McAuliffe made a huge mistake. It reinforced this kind of general, disaffection with what's going on in the schools. It's been exacerbated by COVID, et cetera. And Youngkin won the issue flat out. And when a Republican wins, on education, that's bad news for the Democratic candidate.
So that's pretty interesting. It's one of these instances where perhaps those more entrenched in the political world, their minds are made up. They're gonna support a Republican or a Democrat. But this is an indication that debates matter.
Yeah.
And I don't know if a debate can win it for someone, but it can certainly hurt someone significantly. And It seems to me the data you've seen and the way you're kind of piecing together that debate and the polling, it really hurt McAuliffe.
Yeah, I think it did. And, it's interesting, Roger, looking forward, I think Republicans are, interested in education as an issue that they can campaign on in 2022. Democrats, on the other hand, have responded, at least a lot of them have responded by saying this is a phony issue, that's the critical race theory, CRT is, astroturfed, it's not organic, it's coming down. I think both parties are misreading this.
What do you mean by that? Why are both parties misreading it?
Well, I think
go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think Republicans, here's how I think Republicans are slightly misreading it. I think their sense is this is something they can drive as an issue kind of across the country. I don't think that's correct. I think the issue either exists in a local context or it doesn't. For instance, as I said, in Austin, there are fights over curriculum and how to teach race.
Interesting. So it's really locality by locality, whether or not parents are feeling that the curricula are, is responsive or not responsive to what they want and what they think their children should be taught. And so that's going to vary across not just states, but with, county by county.
Yeah. And I think the cautioner that I would have is you're not going to go into a place where these fights aren't occurring and convince people that they are occurring. I think that's the element of it. Now, they are obviously occurring in a lot of places.
Right. It's certainly not unique to Virginia, but I take the point. Yeah. It may not be, statewide across 50 states. Interesting. Right. As you may know, the Reagan Foundation and Institute has been running a Time for Choosing series, which is a speaker series. We're bringing in leading voices in the conservative movement, Republican Party. A lot of presidential hopefuls have participated, but it's not limited to people like that. I would say when those speakers come in, every speaker does it, they'll talk about restoring American pride, really countering kind of progressive culture that only views American history through a negative lens. That gets tremendous applause and interest from the in-person audience, which is hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 people. And relatedly, when they talk about education and what's being taught to our students, and you can be honest about history, but you also have American pride, that type of language, anecdotally, Daron, it's probably the biggest applause line speaker will receive. So I raise that because the consultants and the people crafting these speeches definitely think that it may not be something a voter is feeling with respect to their child or their locality or county, but they do feel that there's a national issue afoot here that they want a candidate to address.
Yeah, it's absolutely correct. I would happily concede that point. I think I'll go even further. So I do think that the way in which this is approached, my only point is that I think arguing that your particular school administrators are out of touch because they're pushing CRT. If they're not pushing CRT, is an odd claim to
Right.
make. But to your general point, I think there's a sense, and this is kind of a broader story. I mean, you see it in public opinion research where one of the things that we think is a foundation for voting turnout, which we can get back to in a minute here, is civics education in high school. And the way I was taught was that voting is the only question was, is voting a duty or an obligation? And we parse the words obligation versus duty, right? And this is something that my sons were in Boy Scouts, and part of the Citizenship and Nation merit badge is having these conversations about this kind of stuff. The sense I think amongst voters is that kind of civics education, which pushes your obligation as a citizen of the United States, is increasingly absent from school curriculum.
Right.
Parents teach it, but it's not reinforced in the schools. And I think the notion now is that it's not only not taught, that it is undermined by what's going on in the public schools. And there's a long story here about the kinds of people professionally and their ideological orientation that have moved into school administrator positions, and the agenda that they have, and there's an ideological imbalance that it's become a place where people in the 1960s who were kind of had ideas about public education, sort of moved into public ed, and now are decision makers and kind of dominant voices there, and that it's changed the entire fabric.
Right. And this what you're characterizing here is for sure perhaps what's driving this concern, and why this is something people are so responsive to. I want to move to one part of your resume, which and the particular role that you played in the 2020 presidential election. Then we'll talk about your article, The Turnout Myth, which appeared in National Affairs, and really is where I want to dig into for most of the balance of our conversation. But I can't have you on the show without kind of addressing you as your co-director of the Fox News poll, and going back to the 2020 presidential election, where Fox made the call that Biden won Arizona, and that was ahead of others. Obviously, President Trump was highly critical of that, and there was a lot of criticism thrown at the Fox News decision desk. Without hopefully not traumatizing you, but take us through that a little bit. And did that go down the way it should? Upon reflection, seems to be, with multiple audits in Arizona from all sorts of people who have reviewed it. It's obviously stood the test of time. How do you look at that and kind of share that with our listeners and viewers? What happened in Arizona on election night?
Sure. Well, there's a real quick backdrop, and that is up until, I want to say 1996 until 2016, Fox was one of 6 members of the exit polling consortium, and so ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC, Fox News, Associated Press, all pooled resources and engaged a vendor who would go out and conduct exit polls. Traditional
exit polls, just so everybody's on the same page, right? You're outside the polling, someone's just voted, and they kind of share what happened with that individual, and that gives you the tools to predict an outcome.
Right. You're predicting outcomes, and it's also, you're getting data back that allows the networks to describe what happened. As you suggested earlier, Roger, there's just 2 elements of it, right? You're trying to tell people who won and then why. And in fact, from media perspective, the why is the who won is the 2 minutes at the top of the hour, and then the why is the 58 minutes in the remainder of the show. So Associated Press and Fox broke from the consortium after the 2016 elections. And a large part of it was that there's so much early vote out there that we were a little, dissatisfied, or at least thought that the methodology was shifting in a way that we wanted to try to incorporate. And so we piloted a new system along with Associated Press in 2018 and 2020. So you fast forward the 2020 election, and I think this new methodology, where we were doing thousands and thousands of interviews in the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days up until the election, and then on election day, allowed us to have really good insight into not simply the election day vote, but the early vote.
Fascinating.
So,
So voters, states now are giving voters the opportunity to vote early, and people are taking advantage of it, particularly in a pandemic, right? So
Yep.
it was going to be utilized a lot more than perhaps in the past. You had a framework for getting after that, so you're coming into election night, and you already have a good sense of how things are going to turn based on that polling.
Right. And this is not because the exit poll, to be clear, they supplement the exit poll with some pre-election polls, and they understand that. But we think, we have a lot of confidence in our estimate. And as you suggested, the trend towards early voting was magnified by the pandemic. So states that didn't even have significant early voting programs adopted them for 2020. In the particular case of Arizona, what happened is, in some ways, for your audience, simple math, which is we have a standard of 1 in 1,200. There has to be lower than a 1 in 1,200 chance that the estimate by statistical properties is random noise. And once you get once you meet that standard, you're in position to make a call. And so the data that we had, which involved
this standard, you said this, which not having a statistical kind of background or training, that's not a particularly controversial thing. That must be like kind of the standard best way to go about it, 1 in 1,200. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. After the 2000 election, where it had its own issues, obviously, the standard was 1 in 400, and most of the networks, maybe all of them, but I'll just say most of them, moved to a slightly more demanding standard, which means that, just for your audience, so 1 in 1,200 simply means that if you ran this scenario 1,200 times, you only one time would the other side win. So the chance that it's a statistical anomaly, that it's an outlier, is really, really minimal. And in the case of Arizona, we hit that standard, at 1 in the morning or something like that, Eastern time. And what people were angry about is like, well, there was a lot of vote that was outstanding. Well, we had estimates because of the way we were running our poll, estimates of not only the election day vote, but the early vote. And what we knew was that the early vote was kind of bifurcated, that, we thought that our estimate was Trump needed 58.5% of the outstanding vote in order to win. And our estimate was he was going to get about 52.5%.
And how did it play out?
It played out, he ended up getting about 55% of that vote.
Between the 52 and 58.
Right. And so, it was funny, going on Twitter is a dangerous thing, Roger, but we would go on Twitter and people would say, well, Fox was lucky, and a lot of it was congratulatory. Fox ended up being right, but in terms of, from our point of view, we thought, well, actually the chance that Trump got 55% was about 1 in 200, right? So he actually did much better than he should have done, given the data that we were seeing. But that's why we had that really demanding standard.
So it reinforced that scale that you had.
Absolutely. I mean, what
were you a little nervous though? I mean, as they're doing.
Well, I tell you what we were. We were angry at Arizona irrationally, but we know what they were doing. They were counting what we call the late early vote. People who put their ballots in the day before on election day. And we knew Trump was going to get about 58% of that vote. So what was happening is they were counting that vote first. And so people who had their spreadsheets at home were like, hey, Trump's hitting his targets. Boy, Fox must be sweating. Now, we knew that was the best Trump could possibly do. And he wasn't over it. He was barely, kind of getting what he needed. We knew once they went into the early votes that he was going to fall short. And so we knew that, and we kept telling, people at the network and Republicans, look, we're sorry about this, but he's going to be short, and he's going to be, initially we thought it was going to be about a 20,000 vote spread, ended up being about 12,500 or something like that. So yeah, we had him under what he ended up getting, but not something that made us, incredibly uncomfortable. The interesting thing was just the way the call was played and reacted to. I mean, from our perspective, you hit a standard and you inform the people, and then the people make the call to the network, and it goes out to Brett Baer and Martha McCallum and Shannon and others. But we were a little, when we understand what we do, we understand why people watch, right? These calls are important, but the vitriol and the pushback was surprising, and it put us in a position to defend the call, and we were happy to defend the call.
Well, you had your
But,
methodology and you explain it, but that's a
yeah,
lot of scrutiny there.
yeah, it
Last
was.
question on this, and we'll go to your academic article, which in some ways is as interesting, but probably less scrutinized than
Yeah.
making the call in Arizona. You send that information up, you're ahead of others. You have your methodology. You're ready to call Arizona. It's the network that will make the decision whether or not we want to go live with this. Was there a kind of a longer period of time where deliberating whether to make it public, or is the methodology, hey, as soon as Daron and team send us the outcome, we give it to Brett Baer and he tells the world?
No, it goes through the head of the decision desk, and Bill Salmon at the time, and Bill basically turns to us. He goes, "Are you sure?" And we walk it through, and there has to be unanimity on the decision desk, all the members of the desk, and he says, "Okay," and Bill and other people who've worked the decision desk know to ask questions. Okay, what about provisional ballots? What about late ballots? And so you go
The
through
late
that.
early voting ballots.
Exactly. And you have to be able to explain it to them, because they have to be able to explain it to the talent and to the producers and things like that. So we go through the ringer a couple of times, and I have no idea how much, and it is the case that AP was, because Fox was in the system with AP. AP made the call about the same time that Fox did. In fact, they might have been right on top of us. So it was interesting from our perspective. We were pleased that AP saw the data the same way that we did. The other networks were in a trickier position, because our sense after the fact, it was kind of funny, because we put them in an awkward position because they weren't calling the race.
Mm-hmm.
But we weren't looking at the same data. That's something that I think has never really been kind of properly communicated to people. They had their own exit poll. They didn't have the same data that we had. So we were very attentive to not criticizing anybody else, right? That's not
right.
We're looking at, I understand it's the vote ultimately determines, but the models that we were using weren't relying on the same data as they were. They weren't so reticent to criticize us, which we understood, because they were defending their caution. But our collective opinion is that we wish they would have
taken fire from everybody, from the disappointed Trump supporter watching Fox to the other networks who didn't like you got there first.
Yeah. But by the way, Rod, just as a quick aside, I think what it revealed, though, about elections is the significant mail-in votes, which take days to be counted. You have to process them and then count them. And when those mail-in votes, when the vote by mode is really distinctively one side or the other, and in this case, it was so democratic, which I think was a strategic error on the part of Trump, which is telling his supporters
not
don't
to vote
do
early.
How do you fault a Trump voter who's watching and their candidate is up by 10,000 or 100,000 votes on election night, and over the course of the next few days that margin comes down? We kept pleading with people, and I think the people at Fox did a pretty good job with this, but you have to tell people this is why this is happening, that it doesn't necessarily mean there's fraud. It's just kind of the way the vote by mode is working right now. But I do think it is an open question about this mail-in system and relying on the Postal Service to deliver ballots and then have them processed and counted after the election. I'm very skeptical about whether that's what we want to be doing moving forward.
Are you skeptical about mail-in voting because of the doubt it sows in the mind of the electorate and raises a suspicion of fraud, or do you actually think mail-in voting in some ways undermines voter and voting integrity?
I think the former.
Okay.
I think the problem when you have situations like in California, for instance, so California adopted this ballot harvesting,
Yes.
In advance of 2018, where members of groups or political parties are allowed to go out and collect ballots and then deliver them to these sites. There's no evidence in 2018 or 2020 that there was fraud associated with that. But you've legalized a system where the potential to do mischief exists. And I'm what I would like, Roger, is I actually like the old days where we had an election day. What I would prefer is to have, have like a 3-day election day. Start on a Saturday, go Monday, and have go through Monday, where Monday's a national holiday, vote in person with a paper trail, and then tabulate them that day.
I want to get to the article, but now you've opened up the discussion about claims of voter and voting integrity versus voter and voting suppression. This issue is kind of rampant in discussion after 2020, allowing people to vote early, particularly think about the aged, for example. Don't you enhance voting by mail-in voting, right? And not allowing it and forcing people to vote on just one day, or only, in your case, 2 or 3 days, in some ways would suppress the ability of those to vote?
Right. In most states, the obvious exceptions are people with disabilities, the aged, and then in the case of Texas, there's interesting exceptions for people who are out of county. And what we're largely talking about in the case of Texas are students who are, at the University of Texas, but their residential address is in Dallas or Houston. And those are obvious exceptions, and I think everybody would support those. But what we've shown in the political science literature is that most early voting simply cannibalizes election day voting. People who are 99% likely to vote on election day are 100% likely to vote if you give them an opportunity to vote 2 weeks beforehand. I vote convenience voting. I do early in person in Texas.
Yeah, because you got the Fox News.
Yeah, I gotta go. I gotta go to New York on election day. But there's not a lot of evidence that convenience voting significantly increases turnout. And the other thing is it creates, not to go total nerd on you, but information asymmetries. That is, I vote 3 weeks before the actual election day. In a presidential election, that rarely matters. You don't really learn too much about it. We know these men and women beforehand. But for lower visibility down ballot races, stuff comes out, and it comes out late. And I think that's an issue for the quality of democracy.
Wait, I wouldn't have voted for McAuliffe if I knew he was going to say that at the debate, for example.
Yeah, or some scandal comes out a week before.
Makes sense. Perhaps another session on the show we'll talk about these issues, but I got to go to another area of polling and data analysis that you've done, and that is with voter turnout. Really interesting article you published in National Affairs. The title is, "Does High Voter Turnout Help One Party?" And you argue that both Republicans and Democrats, so this is not one party's view, but it's both sides, seem to be convinced that higher turnout, that means an election where you get more people voting, helps Democrats and hurts Republicans. That's the mindset of so-called consultants and political experts. And you have analyzed the data, and it's not the case. Tell us what you found and the kind of the argument you put in this National Affairs article. Super interesting. We'll link to it for the show.
Sure. I should acknowledge my co-author, John Petrosic, who is chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Missouri. He's retired now, riding his bike out in Arizona. So it's a good job out of John. But we looked at presidential election results, gubernatorial election results, Senate election results, House election results going back to the 1940s. And we're looking at the pattern of relationship, simple bivariate initially, although we upped the ante a little bit later, between partisan vote choice, that is percent vote for the Democrat or Republican, and turnout. And there is no systematic, consistent relationship where higher turnout leads to better performance for Democratic candidates. It is essentially, if you plot it, it's a flat line. Higher levels of turnout don't really affect the proportion of the party vote going one side or the other.
Well, why does that make sense? I mean, if you have a state, tell us how voter registration interacts with this, right? So if I'm in a district, locality,
right,
so we're registered for one party, this doesn't impact it one way or the other.
No, what we're looking at is turnout amongst what we call we analyze both the voting age population and the voter eligible population. Right. Voter eligible just takes out people who are institutionalized, in prison or mental facilities or things like that. And they're not actually able to vote, so they shouldn't be in the denominator, right? But by either metric, there is no relationship, right? So we're equalizing across states which have same-day registration, like Minnesota. Colorado has moved to same-day registration, a bunch of states like that. And you would think, well, those states are going to have high turnout, and don't they lean Democratic? And no, actually, the logic of the argument is fairly compelling. The logic of the argument is that people who are less likely to vote are lower socioeconomic status, they're younger, they tend to be disproportionately racial ethnic minorities. And so people say, well,
But
those
you'd assume
also,
that those categories would be Democratic voters.
exactly. And so the argument has always been, and it's not just the United States, you see this argument made in other countries as well, that lower status, younger voters, they're latent Democrats. If only they showed up, they would realize, the sort of Democratic potential. But what John and I find, Petrosik and I find in the data, is that their distinguishing characteristic is they're not that interested, they're not that engaged, they're not very involved with politics. So when they do show up, when these peripheral or casual voters show up, they vote for whoever is advantaged by prevailing political conditions. Sometimes that's the Republican, sometimes that's the Democrat.
Mind-blowing. So not only does it not dictate, voter turnout, doesn't favor one party, but actually what you're learning here is that perhaps Democrats and Republicans are taking voters for granted, and they're actually gettable when they decide to turn out and vote. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, and the example, Roger, would be 1984 versus 2008.
We love 1984 here on the show.
Yeah, we do. I know. In 1984, casual. We actually looked at the preferences of non-voters using the national election studies, because it's a national sample. Some people vote, some people don't, and we validate the data after the election. We go in and find out, is there a record of the person having voted according to the state registrars? And if you look at non-voters in 1984, guess who they supported? They supported Reagan even more than voters did. And it's, the analogy we use, it was the strongest prevailing political wind. And that's the only thing that peripheral voters tend to hear. So
the so-called Reagan Democrat would have been perhaps the voter who, well, I guess some of it was Democrats who voted Democratic pre-election, but also perhaps people they assumed to be Democratic, but voted for Reagan when they came out there, even though they were a casual voter.
That's right. And the same dynamic occurred in 2008 in the opposite direction. It's a big Democratic year, and non-voters preferred Barack Obama by a more sizable rate than voters did. So now what was funny is in 2018, Petrosik and I had were workshopping this argument, and people said, aha, 2018 was a high turnout election and the Democrats won. And our response is, yes, of course. There was a short-term force that favored the Democrats. So I don't want to, the argument is falsifiable, right? Our argument would be that, well, if you find an election in which the short-term force favors the Republicans, but these peripheral voters favor the Democrats, that would falsify our argument.
But you haven't seen that.
But we haven't seen one of those.
Well, take me through another election, non-expert view, but I think general perception, 2016, if there had been higher turnout for Hillary Clinton, right? She didn't get the turnout, let's say, that a Barack Obama did in 2008 and 2012. If there had been higher turnout, Daron, would Hillary Clinton have been elected president of the United States based on your analysis?
Right. We actually took a look at 2016 for exactly this reason. And we went into the voter file, and
look at him. He's pulling out the book here. We're getting the real data analysis.
I'm pulling out the book just to make sure that I'm consistent with what we actually published out here. And what we showed is what the election outcome would have been at varying rates of turnout. So 1% turnout all the way through 100% turnout. And what we found, so we're essentially imputing preferences based on all these other characteristics that voters have. So we know how people who voted, but we don't know how the non-voters voted. But we can take a look at the non-voters and basically kind of impute based on what they look like, all their demographic characteristics and these other things, impute values. And what we found is that if 10% of the electorate had voted, according to our estimates, the result would have been 49 to 48, right? So in other words, these are only the core voters, right? Clinton wins by 1 point. If it goes to 100%, Clinton wins 49-46. So there is a turnout effect. If you go from 10% to 100%, Hillary
But that would not have been
2
enough to
points more.
impact the electoral
No.
college outcome.
No, it's kind of fascinating to look at these things over time, because the 2016 data analysis we did is similar to other election
All
analyses.
right, well, let me pull the thread on this argument a bit. So why does turnout matter? Why do we care about turnout? Because whether I'm a Democrat or Republican, if I get, like you said in 2016, 10% or 100%, the same result will occur.
Yeah, well, I should be clear on this. So the Virginia example we raised earlier, let's return to Virginia, right?
Okay.
The story in Virginia was it ended up being a high turnout election. And I think the high turnout election was what got McAuliffe as close as he did to winning the race, right? We were a week out showing that, there's a 6, 7, 8 point Youngkin lead. And that was, but remember, that dynamic kind of had the Republicans jazzed up, and Republicans were committed to voting, and the Democrats were less so. So what happened, I think, in the last week or so was that Democratic enthusiasm and commitment levels rose. In other words, the turnout rate got higher and higher because the people who were, kind of engaged late tended to be disproportionately Democratic. So the high turnout in that race, ultimately, it obviously didn't save the Democrats, right? I mean, this was a state where, Democrats, Biden won by, I think, 12 points.
Yeah, it's
in
gone
2020. But, the fact that turnout rose and rose and rose actually, ended up helping McAuliffe a little bit. But, it was a record high turnout in,
so
an
it's kind of
off-year
like
election.
You want to get the turnout of those who are registered Democrats, if you're pushing, advancing a Democratic candidate, similarly on the Republican side. But overall turnout, what I'm hearing here is that's not really going to shape the outcome one way or the other.
No, you're just trying to get, each side is trying to get their people to the polls, their sort of identifiable voters. And that's what campaigns do. And that's, a big deal, and it's important. But what we're talking about are people who are less reliable, less partisan.
The casual voter.
Yeah, you think they sort of look like your folks. And the problem is, the analogy John and I used casually, I don't think we actually used it in the book, was that, the elections are like Super Bowls. There are hardcore fans who are Cowboy fans or Patriot fans, and they're going to be there. But most of the people, they're just there for the party, and they tend to pick up on whatever the prevailing wind is. And some, so you get a lot of Cowboy and Patriot fans when they're in the Super Bowl, because that's all people hear about. But they're not really football fans. They're not going to be there for some game in October.
Fascinating. Let's shift out of your article, The Turnout Myth. Encourage everybody listening and watching to read that in National Affairs. Just kind of goes against public perception, I think, in terms of the connection between turnout, voter turnout, and election outcomes. Here at the Reagan Institute, we've worked with you on our Reagan National Defense Survey for a number of years now. It recently came out, and it polls, from our views, a public opinion poll on questions that we think are generally not consistently explored, in polling, and that is American views with respect to foreign policy, national security, America's role in the world. Taking a broad view of this poll that we've worked on for a number of years together, we've done 4 of these polls, I think, since 2018. Give me your sense of how the everyday American views kind of foreign policy and their instincts on defense and foreign policy. I know you've done polling like this in the past, but my sense is, Daron, this is the most in-depth you've done on this suite of issues. Just as a person who looks at polling all the time, what are kind of your broad takeaways over the years from this polling, the Reagan National Defense Survey?
Yeah, Roger, you're right. I mean, I do a ton of polling, and a national poll every month for Fox, and more than that in election years. But rarely do you get a chance to really explore the range of public opinion on national defense issues and foreign policy issues. And so working with the Reagan Institute on this is just a pleasure. It's just fascinating to get a chance to really engage these questions. I would say, and this is, I think, an observation that, and just happens to be true, but I think is also consistent with some of the core principles of the Reagan Institute. What we find is that Americans have a strong sense of commitment to, being engaged in foreign policy. There is obviously an isolationist sentiment that exists in American foreign policy. This is something that goes back, hundreds of years into the
Yes.
American psyche,
It's
right?
our founding.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's not unexpected, but I think one of the interesting contributions of Ronald Reagan and the Reagan presidency to American public opinion is a sense of commitment and a sense of purpose. And now this obviously exists coming out of the Second World War, but there's a focus to it given by President Reagan that I think is in some sense underappreciated in certainly the political science and perhaps the foreign policy literature writ large, which is in counter to this isolation sentiment. There is a sense that America needs to be community engaged for American interests, to proliferate, for this sense of democracy and sort of justice abroad.
A free world is good for our own national interest in the form of prosperity and peace, but also just
Exactly
a good thing.
Exactly, and that's something when a lot of the political science literature comes out of two strains. It's sort of exploring isolationism and exploring attitudes towards wars and commitments of U.S. forces abroad. And I'm interested in that, and that's with the Iraq and Afghanistan,
Sure.
we still have elements of that in our polling. But the sort of broader notion about should we be engaged, should we be at the forefront of some of these important issues, human rights, challenging China, promoting American interests abroad. There is consensus that America needs to do that. And there's disagreement over the shape and form. And one of the things that I know, Roger, you and I have seen in the poll, the last couple of polls in particular, the spring poll we did in 2021, and then again in this fall poll, is a little bit of skepticism about some of the institutions.
Yeah,
American
that's the one I wanted to
institutions.
drill down on, and we got a few minutes left before we go to lightning round, but I'm glad you hit on this. When we started this Reagan National Defense Survey together in 2018, 70% said they had a great deal of confidence in the military. So we asked about a bunch of institutions. The military, by far, was the most trusted institution. And as I just said, 70% felt they had a great deal of confidence. Now, in this latest survey, 45% say that. So you have this remarkable kind of downward trend. And it cuts against something that was very important to President Reagan, which was restoring, faith and confidence and trust in the military. It was a big accomplishment during his years in office. What's your take on that, Daron? And does that line up with kind of the other polls you're seeing in the mood of the country, or is it unique? Is it sui generis here vis-a-vis the U.S. military?
It's a great question, because you do see this collapse, might be too strong a word, but significant decrease in confidence in some of these traditional institutions. And the military is sort of the on the same side of the coin, I would say, is police and law enforcement in the United States, where in our 2018 survey, November 2018, we had 50% expressing a great deal of confidence in police and law enforcement, and that number is now 33%. So the higher the confidence kind of in our baseline surveys in the 2018 cycle, the more room there was for support or confidence to come down. For instance, I mean, you could just be like the U.S. Congress, where it was like 6%, back then, and
you
now
live under
5%.
10%.
Yeah. But you see it across institutions. So I don't want to make too much. The Supreme Court was 27%, now it's 18. The presidency was 28%, now it's 19. So you do see this across the board. But I think it's come with a little bit of a logic to it. So you have some events like Afghanistan, and withdrawal from Afghanistan in particular. And then there is a sense that we see in some of our open-ended data where we ask people, why do you have the confidence that you have in the military, either positive or negative? And on the positive side, people talk about the servicemen and women, the soldiers,
Right.
and the mission, keeping us safe. On the negative side, political leadership, partisanship, polarization. And so I think, Roger, what you're seeing is a sense in the American public that some of these institutions that were above partisanship in our perceptions.
Interesting.
Are they above partisanship anymore?
Right. And now,
that
and the
doubt,
leadership, perhaps to the extent they're in that mud of partisanship and, politicization, now it's impacting their view of the institution. Let me ask you one more. China has been a growing concern we've seen in the minds of the American people year over year. This year's poll, we see that it is viewed, China, that is the greatest threat facing the American people. We didn't have that before by large margin. There's really no other country that comes close. And then relatedly, you see that there is a strong view. 72% believe the theory that the coronavirus was leaked from a lab in Wuhan.
Yeah.
Talk to me about the mindset of American people vis-a-vis China. Specifically, they're thinking about coronavirus and its origins from China.
Yeah, well, just to make the point even more stark relief, I think in 2018 we asked people about which country is the greatest threat. 21% said China, 30% Russia, 18% North Korea. So those top three. Now in our latest poll, 52% China, 14% Russia, 12% North Korea. So something's changed. Something has changed. I think it's a combination of two things. One is the coronavirus. There is a sense that, and you see this, I guess, a lot of your listeners and viewers probably remember Jon Stewart going on Stephen Colbert's show and basically, a guy with strong credentials on the left saying, how could you not think that this is a plausible explanation for this, right? And I think that caught people's attention because it's
Jon Stewart.
Yeah,
thinks this is reasonable.
Right. But it dovetails with this notion. And what you see in the data, and I would encourage people when they get an opportunity to take a look at the data on this, because the threat from China is seen as so multifaceted. What you never saw with Russia or North Korea was a perception that those countries were anything other than a military/political threat.
Great point.
With China, it's military, it's political, it's technological, it's foreign policy, economic, exactly. And so the range of the threat, the diversity of the threat is really
and it's fascinating that you see that in the polling. It kind of splits almost evenly across all those areas of concern. So you can't kind of limit it to one area. It's almost every area of your life is threatened, challenged by China's rise. And
that is novel, right? That was not the case. Yeah, I mean, you go back to the days of the Cold War, and I wish we had comparison data, but maybe Russia was seen as an economic threat, but I don't think people, not the way China is right now. And so the multifaceted nature of the threat is something we don't have precedent for.
Well, we're going to jump to the lightning round. Those who want to learn more about the Reagan National Defense Survey, you can go to the reaganfoundation.org/defense survey. We didn't get to President Reagan. I'll just mention it. Once again, comes out tops in the survey amongst presidents since Jimmy Carter. The question asked, favorability or lack thereof for presidents since Jimmy Carter through President Biden. Once again, President Reagan tops all others. Daron, the Reagan Foundation, though it pays for the survey to be done by professionals, it does not pay for that outcome, correct?
That is correct. I can attest to that. I was hoping for a bonus, but apparently that's not in the offing.
Well, let's go to our lightning round. This is where our guests share their favorite book on Reagan, favorite speech by President Reagan, and favorite Reagan quote. Daron, what do you have for us?
Well, I think I'm going fairly conventional on the first two. The Ronald Reagan Diaries, I think, from an academic point of view, and maybe people will find this interesting as well. There was a sense amongst eggheads that, sure, Reagan, gave these speeches and was popular, but intellectually he was a lightweight. He wasn't, he wasn't even responsible. Yeah, exactly. And the Reagan Diaries had a profound impact, I think, on historians' judgment of Reagan, because I find them sort of personally fascinating, but I also find them professionally a turning point in how historians kind of conceived of Reagan and his sense of, we were talking about threat, his sense of the place of the United States in this Cold War, and place in history, the fundamental kind of nature of conservatism, what it was and what it wasn't, which sort of permeates these kind of daily ruminations. I think it's really interesting, and I also think there's some some elements as you see people like CNN and others do documentaries on the 1980s, and with all due respect, some of them pushing a particular agenda on issues like AIDS
Sure.
and crime and things like that. And that narrative, I think, runs aground at least some of the more pernicious elements, in my opinion, if you compare it to what Reagan is saying in real time about the nature of
And
some of these problems.
this is authentically his view, unvarnished. This is the diary he kept every day while in office for 8 years. Pretty remarkable.
Right. So
give us your speech and quote.
I got to go with the Challenger.
Yes.
I know it's
drafted.
I know it's conventional, and I wish, it's like saying, the Gettysburg Address is your favorite Lincoln. I wish I had a version of
No
the
need to
second
apologize.
inaugural.
It's a great one. And, it
Yeah.
shows that some of the greatest speeches are the succinct ones, too.
Yeah. And so I'll go there. On quote, I'll go off the board. So I'll give you something different on the quote.
Oh, nice. I'm excited.
My favorite Reagan quote actually was a response. It was when he was governor of California. I'm from San Diego, and I remember this. My parents and grandparents thought it was one of the funniest things they ever saw. He was giving a speech and had given a speech in Berkeley. Protesters had surrounded the sedan, as Reagan was leaving from the speech, and one of them put up a sign to Reagan's car that said, "We are the future." And Reagan, so this is a quote in the form of a response. He wrote a note on a piece of paper and put it back, "I'll sell my bonds now," which I thought was one of the funniest things I've ever heard from a politician. So I don't know if that qualifies as a quote, but it will for my purposes. And
that works for us. And I no previous guest has offered that quote. Daron Shaw, thank you so much for being on the show.
Roger, pleasure to be here.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and on all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.